The crowd roared as Captain Lyle, Shadow Kane marched toward his doom. Wrists bound in heavy chains, shoulders unbowed, Black Hollow's gallows loomed ahead, sharp against the sky, waiting to claim one of the sea's most elusive captains. The magistrate had finally snared his prey after years of cat and mouse, and his smirk bore the cruel satisfaction of a man certain of victory. For years, the elusive pirate had mocked the law, his ship the Crimson Serpent known across the seas for slipping through blockades, storms, and traps alike. But today, there would be no escape. As he neared the gallows, Kane's dark eyes caught sight of the harbor, where the restless sea stretched beyond the town's docks. And there, shrouded in an unnatural mist, he saw it, a colossal black ship, its tattered sails rippling in an unfelt wind. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen, even with his years roaming the high seas. Its hull was black as the deep ocean, almost as if it absorbed the light around it, and a chill crept down Kane's spine. The townsfolk's jeers dimmed in his mind as he focused on the ship. No one had seen it approach, and no lanterns marked its presence. Its figurehead, a carved skull with hollow eyes, seemed to watch him even from a distance. The crowd, sensing a shift in Kane's gaze, turned to see the monstrous ship in the harbor. Whispers breaking through their shouts of hate, a hush fell. The magistrate's smug expression faltered, his eyes darting toward the dark ship that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. He raised a hand, signaling the executioner to hurry, but it was too late. From the ship came a single, deafening cannon blast. The gallows shook as wood splintered below the platform, sending the crowd scrambling in all directions. Through the haze, a gangplank extended, impossibly long, touching down on the harbor's edge. And from the shadows emerged a woman, her eyes glinting like embers, dressed in a captain's coat torn and weathered by unknown storms. Captain Morganna of the Eclipse, a name Kane had heard whispered by men who feared nothing. They said her ship prowled the sea as if cursed, with no allegiance to man or country. Before we set sail, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And if you were part of this crew, what role would you take on? The navigator? The lookout? Let's see who's brave enough to join this adventure. Captain Kane! Morganna's voice cut through the chaos like a knife, rich and mocking. You owe me a debt, and I've come to collect. Kane, bound and helpless, gave her a narrow-eyed glare, though his mind raced. Their paths had crossed only once before, years ago, when Morganna was still alive, or so he'd thought. She had been another ambitious pirate then, eager to conquer the seas as he was. But storms had swallowed her and her crew, or so he'd assumed. Yet here she was, her skin pale as sea foam, her eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. Take him, Morganna ordered, and her crew, a silent, spectral lot with eyes hidden by the shadows of their hoods, descended upon the gallows. The magistrate stammered, ordering the guards to raise their muskets, but every shot fired simply vanished into the mist, swallowed by the unnatural silence of the harbor. A rope was thrown to Kane and he seized it, a fierce glint in his eyes. With swift movement, he climbed up as cannon fire exploded again, scattering the last of the crowd. Morganna's voice rang in his ears as he reached the gangplank. It's time to pay up, Kane. You're bound to me now. The Eclipse pulled back into the harbor, gliding through the mist as if it were no more than a dream. Kane was escorted onto the deck, surrounded by silent figures. His gaze darted to the crew, but they stared ahead, their faces obscured, their movements as fluid as if driven by a force beyond themselves. Once they were safely on the deck, Morganna turned to him, a sly grin spreading across her face. You remember Valtoras, don't you? Kane swallowed. The Isle of Valtoras, a name shrouded in fear even among hardened pirates. Legends spoke of the cursed isle, where treasures lay hidden amidst the ruins of a lost civilization. Treasures that lured only to doom those who dared seek them. Kane had tried once, years back, only to abandon the quest after his crew vanished one by one in the mist. What do you want from me, Morganna? He asked, forcing his voice to stay steady. You, Kane, are going to lead me to that treasure, Morganna replied, her tone gleeful, as if it were a simple favor. And if you fail, you'll join my crew. For eternity. Kane felt a cold dread knot in his stomach. There was no escaping now. He had crossed a line beyond any he'd dared before, and the penalty was one he couldn't imagine. The fog thickened, wrapping around the ship, and as they glided into the unknown, Kane knew one thing for sure. This was a journey he might never return from. The Eclipse cut through the fog with eerie silence, leaving the trembling lights of Black Hollow far behind. Captain Lyle Kane stood on deck, surrounded by the spectral crew, their hollow eyes fixed forward, and the silence between them grew as dense as the mist itself. With each passing hour, Kane's unease grew. The ship moved without sound, and the wind seemed to whisper secrets he couldn't understand. Captain Morganna stood at the helm, her eyes fixed ahead, her presence both magnetic and foreboding. Every now and then, Kane's gaze would drift to the crew. They moved with a strange, fluid grace, each footstep soundless, each movement precise. They never spoke, never looked at him, and their faces remained shadowed, concealed as if they were not entirely real. His skin prickled as he considered the truth. This crew was not of the living. Finally, unable to contain himself, Kane approached Morganna, who stood at the helm with a distant look, as if watching something only she could see. "What exactly do you want with the treasure of Valtoras?" he demanded, his voice harsh, though laced with the caution of a man surrounded by things he didn't understand. "You have me, Morganna. You've got your ship, your cursed crew. Why Valtoras?" Morgana's lips curled into a cold smile. "Ah, Kane, the treasure isn't what you think. Gold and jewels mean little to me now." Her voice dropped, taking on a distant, haunted quality. "There's something buried there. Something that will bind my fate back to the living. I'm trapped between worlds, Kane. And you're the only one who's ever returned from Valtoras, alive at least." Kane grimaced, recalling the horrors of that cursed isle. The mist that never lifted, the silent shadows that seemed to watch his every step, and the ruins that whispered of ancient curses. "You're chasing shadows, Morganna," he replied, though a flicker of fear rippled through him. He knew Valtoras well enough to know that some shadows had teeth. As if sensing his reluctance, Morgana's expression hardened. "We have an agreement, Kane. If you fail, you'll stay here, bound to the Eclipse, forever. Or would you prefer to swim back to Black Hollow?" Kane clenched his jaw, staring down at the silent crew. The thought of being bound to this cursed ship, trapped between life and death, twisted his gut with dread. He gave Morganna a defiant nod. "I'll take you to Valtoras, but once we're done, I'm free of you." Her laughter was soft and cold. "Oh, Kane, you've never been free. But lead me well and I'll consider it." Hours drifted by like smoke on the water, each minute heavy with the anticipation of what lay ahead. The crew worked in perfect silence, adjusting sails and shifting ropes without a word or a glance. Kane tried speaking to one of them, a towering man with a scar across his cheek, but the figure didn't respond, only continued his task with mechanical precision. Days passed, and the journey grew darker, the air colder. The closer they drew to Valtoras, the stranger the sea became. One night, Kane noticed a faint glow beneath the surface of the water, a strange pale light that seemed to follow the eclipse. When he asked Morganna, her response was chilling. "The spirits of those who never returned. They're bound to the waters around Valtoras, watching for fools like us." That night, Kane could barely sleep, haunted by visions of ghostly faces beneath the waves, their eyes wide and unblinking. The crew moved through the ship like shadows, carrying out their tasks with eerie silence, and Kane began to feel as though he were the only living soul aboard. As they neared the cursed isle, the Eclipse creaked and groaned, as though in anticipation. Kane stood at the prow, his eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of Valtoras appearing through the thickening mist. Black cliffs loomed ahead, rising sharply from the churning waters, their jagged peaks clawing at the sky. The island seemed to exude a cold malice, a warning that twisted the very air around it. Morganna joined him at the prow, her eyes gleaming with a hunger he couldn't quite place. "This is it, Kane. Lead us to what you once found. Don't even think of holding back." As they lowered a boat into the churning water, Kane felt a shiver run through him. He'd come to this island before, seeking riches and legends. What he'd found instead were shadows that whispered of ancient power, ruins that seemed alive, and a horror he'd fled from, abandoning even his crew. The mist on Valtoras was thicker, clinging to him like cold fingers as they rowed to shore. Every breath felt heavy, as though the island itself resisted his presence. Morganna watched him, her gaze sharp, unyielding, and Kane knew she wouldn't tolerate any attempt to deceive her. Whatever power lay hidden on this cursed isle, she intended to claim it. When they finally stepped onto the shore, the ground was soft and strange, sinking slightly under their weight. The ruins of an ancient temple rose in the distance, its broken pillars barely visible through the thick mist. Kane remembered the temple well. He remembered the silence, the statues of forgotten gods that seemed to watch his every step, and the feeling of being unwelcome. As they entered the ruins, Morganna's demeanor shifted. Her eyes narrowed and her voice dropped to a whisper. "Lead me to the heart of the temple, Kane. There lies what I seek." The walls of the temple were covered in strange symbols, shapes, and creatures that seemed to writhe under the torchlight. Shadows danced along the cracked stone, moving with a life of their own. Kane led Morganna down a winding corridor, each step feeling heavier, as though the weight of centuries pressed upon him. He could feel the island's resentment, an ancient anger that pulsed in the air. And then in the heart of the temple they found it, a massive stone altar, upon which lay a golden idol, twisted and misshapen, its eyes set with rubies that seemed to glint with malevolent light. Morganna's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. This was what she'd sought, a relic that was said to grant life to those trapped between worlds, a relic cursed by the very gods who had abandoned the island. As she reached for the idol, the room trembled. Kane stepped back, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But Morganna's eyes were locked on the idol, her hand outstretched, her expression one of obsession. "With this, I will finally break free," she murmured, her voice shaking. "No, Morganna," Kane said, feeling a sudden certainty. "That thing is cursed. It's what bound you in the first place." Her eyes flashed with anger. "You know nothing, Kane. I've been a shadow long enough. This will restore me." The room shook again, cracks spreading through the stone walls as shadows seemed to gather around them, taking form, blocking their way back. Kane's eyes darted to the exit, but Morganna was fixated on the idol, her fingers closing around it as if nothing else mattered. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the chamber, a voice deep and ancient, filled with the fury of a forgotten god. "Those who dare claim the forbidden power must pay the price." It boomed, and the very air grew thick, pressing down on them. Morganna's grip tightened, defiance burning in her eyes as she clutched the idol. But Kane saw her fear, saw the flicker of doubt. The shadows closed in, their forms indistinct but menacing, their eyes like embers. With a sudden movement, Kane grabbed Morganna's arm, pulling her back as the idol began to glow, casting a sickly light across the chamber. "Kane!" she shouted, her voice a mix of rage and desperation. But he didn't let go, dragging her toward the exit as the temple groaned, the stones cracking and shifting, as if the island itself rejected their presence. They stumbled out into the mist, the shadows pursuing them, whispering threats and curses. Kane's heart pounded as they raced through the ruins, Morganna clutching the idol even as fear clouded her gaze. Behind them, the temple began to collapse, the ancient walls caving in, the shadows swirling in fury. As they reached the shore, the Eclipse loomed through the mist, and they scrambled aboard. But Kane knew it wasn't over. The island's curse had followed them, clinging to Morganna's prize, a prize that might yet bring ruin to them all. The Eclipse shuddered as it pulled away from the cursed shore of Valtoras, the waves swelling with unnatural force, as though the very sea rejected their departure. Kane braced himself against the mast, casting a wary glance at Morganna, who clutched the golden idol tightly. The idol's ruby eyes glinted with a sinister light, casting eerie shadows across her face. She held it with a feverish grip, her gaze fixed on it with an obsession that chilled Kane to the bone. "Is it worth this, Morganna?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the ominous groan of the ship. "That thing, it's no key to freedom. It's the chains themselves." Morganna's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "What would you know of such things, Kane?" she spat. "I've wandered the seas as a wraith stuck between life and death. This idol, this power, is my way back." But Kane's words were lost in the tumult as the Eclipse lurched violently. The fog thickened, swirling around them, and Kane felt a sickening realization creep into his mind. They had brought something back with them, something that had no intention of letting Morganna go. The shadows seemed to coil and twist, forming shapes that watched them with unblinking malice, their whispers filling the air like a ghostly chorus. Suddenly the crew, those spectral figures that had remained silent, mindless, stirred. Each one turned to face Morganna, their hollow eyes glinting with a newfound awareness. Kane's heart raced as he recognized the danger. Whatever spell had bound these souls to Morganna had begun to unravel, and the presence of the cursed idol was drawing them back from their slumber. One of the crew, a towering figure with a hollowed gaze and a scar running down his cheek, spoke, his voice a low, broken rasp. "You promised us peace, Morganna. This is not peace." Morganna recoiled, her grip tightening on the idol as she stepped back. "I gave you purpose," she hissed, her voice wavering. "I saved you from the depths, from the endless dark." Kane's mind raced as he watched the scene unfold. He could see the rage, the betrayal simmering in the eyes of the crew. These were men and women she had bound to her, their souls imprisoned within the Eclipse, never to find rest. And now, they were awakening to the truth of their fate.
Hey there! Quick message. Grab a paper, write down. You Pirate. Our channel name. Come back soon. We've got incredible stories you won't want to miss.
With a thunderous boom, a ghostly wind tore through the ship, extinguishing every lantern and throwing the deck into near darkness. Kane barely held his footing as the ship heaved again, and he saw Morganna, her face pale as sea foam, shouting orders that fell on deaf ears. "Kane!" she shouted, turning to him in desperation, her eyes wide. "You're the only one who knows this ship. Help me take control." But Kane's gaze hardened. "You betrayed them, Morganna. You bound them to a curse, and now you'll answer for it." A flash of fury crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by something darker, a flicker of fear. Shadows swirled around the idol in her hands, its ruby eyes glowing brighter, casting a bloody light across the deck. The figures of the crew advanced on her, their faces twisted with the agony of betrayal. In that moment, Kane knew what he had to do. He lunged for the idol, reaching for it just as Morganna raised it, its power pulsing in her grip. They struggled, her fingers clawing at his hands, but his resolve held firm. With a sudden burst of strength, he wrenched the idol from her grasp. "No!" Morganna shrieked, reaching for him, but Kane moved quickly. He held the idol high, feeling the cold, malevolent energy radiating from it, and turned toward the edge of the ship. The shadows closed in around him, their whispers rising to a fevered pitch, demanding that he release the idol back to the sea. Kane hesitated, a shiver running down his spine. He could feel the pull of the curse, a dark promise whispering in his mind. The idol was a gateway, a bridge between worlds. To throw it away was to lose that power forever. Morganna staggered toward him, desperation twisting her face. "Kane, if you throw that overboard, we'll be lost. Don't you see? It's our only chance." But Kane shook his head, his voice cold. "Maybe for you, not for me." And with that, he hurled the idol into the depths. It hit the water with a resounding splash, and for a moment silence blanketed the ship. The shadows recoiled, swirling in agitation, and a strange stillness settled over the crew. Then, from the depths, an inhuman roar echoed through the fog, a sound so chilling that even the spectral crew flinched. The water around the Eclipse began to churn, and from beneath, dark shapes rose, shifting and twisting, forms of those lost to the curse, furious and unbound. They surrounded the ship, their eyes blazing with vengeful fire. The crew stumbled back, their gazes filled with horror as they looked upon the forms of fallen sailors, soldiers, even other pirates, all bound by the same ancient curse that had claimed them. Kane watched as the shades climbed over the ship's rails, their eyes fixated on Morganna, who stood trembling, her bravado shattered. One shade, a man with tattered clothes and hollow eyes, spoke, his voice a ghostly rasp. "You bound us, Morganna. You stole our freedom, condemned us to this hell. Morganna tried to step back, but the specters surrounded her, their forms flickering in the moonlight. She raised her hands, pleading, her voice shaking. I saved you. I kept you alive." The shade shook his head, a cruel smile twisting his spectral face. "You kept us enslaved. Now, you will join us." With that, the shades surged forward, their ghostly hands reaching out. Morganna screamed, her voice shrill, desperate. But there was no escape. The crew, no longer under her control, watched in silence as the shades closed in, their forms enveloping her, dragging her into their grasp. Her screams echoed across the misty sea as they carried her overboard, vanishing into the water's depths with her in tow. The silence that followed was profound, as though the very sea had been sated. Kane stood alone on the deck, breathing hard, his heart pounding. The spectral crew turned to him, their eyes filled with a strange gratitude, their faces softening as if they were finally at peace. One by one, the crew faded, their forms dissolving into the mist, and Kane felt the weight of the curse lifting from the Eclipse. The ship was free, and so were they. The last crew member, the towering figure with the scar, paused, giving Kane a small nod of respect, before he too vanished into the ether, leaving Kane alone. As the dawn light broke over the horizon, Kane stood at the helm of the Eclipse, the mist finally clearing. The cursed ship, now quiet and still, drifted peacefully across the water. The ancient magic that had bound it for so long was gone, and Kane felt the weight of his own freedom settling over him. But the sea was not done with him. In the distance, the shadow of a ship appeared, and Kane's lips curved into a grim smile. He may have escaped the gallows, faced down curses, and survived the wrath of the dead, but he knew his life on the sea was far from over. With the horizon before him and the Eclipse now his own, Kane took hold of the helm, feeling the thrill of adventure surge within him once more. His gaze fixed on the distant waves, and he knew that new dangers, new treasures, and new enemies awaited him. But whatever lay ahead, he would face it as he always had, unbroken, defiant, and free. The dawn spread across the sea, its light slowly peeling away the fog that clung to the Eclipse like the fading remnants of a nightmare. Captain Lyle Kane stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the receding shape of Valtoras. The cursed isle was nearly invisible in the morning mist, but Kane knew the shadow it cast would haunt him forever. The idol was gone, the shades were freed, and Morganna had vanished into the depths, claimed by the very forces she sought to control. He turned his gaze forward, feeling the strange stillness of the Eclipse. The ship, once bound by a curse so deep it had swallowed Morganna and her crew, was now silent, empty save for Kane. Every plank, every line of rope seemed to breathe freely, as if the ancient magic had lifted not just from the ship, but from the waters themselves. He ran a hand along the helm, feeling a strange connection to the wood under his fingers, as if the Eclipse were waiting to see what kind of captain would take its reins next. For the first time since escaping the gallows, Kane felt the thrill of freedom settle deep within him. The Eclipse was his, and with it a future untethered by any master or curse. Yet he knew that the sea did not forgive or forget easily, and tales of cursed islands, lost idols, and ghostly captains had a way of spreading faster than the wind. Just as he was lost in thought, a faint sound reached him. A soft voice carried on the breeze, barely audible. He looked around, half expecting to see a remnant of Morganna or one of the spectral crew. But the deck remained empty, save for the creak of timber and the sigh of the wind. "Do you really think you're free, Kane?" The voice seemed to echo in his mind, though it was neither Morganna's nor any voice he recognized. It held an ancient tone, a warning that tingled in the air like a far-off storm. He shook his head, shrugging off the sensation, but a shadow of doubt lingered. Perhaps the idol's curse was gone, but he wondered if some trace of its dark magic still clung to him. The memory of the shades, the shadows that had whispered to him on Valtoras, lingered like a stain he couldn't wash away. Kane steered the Eclipse west, charting a course away from Valtoras, from Black Hollow, and from the dark memories of Morganna. The sea lay open before him, promising new lands, new riches, and fresh dangers. As he sailed on, he began to wonder what he might do with this newfound freedom. Return to piracy? Seek treasure? Or perhaps disappear into some hidden cove, living off the fortune he'd amassed over the years? But even as he considered a life of peace, a pang of restlessness took hold. He was a captain of the sea, not a farmer or a trader. He belonged to the waves, to the open sky, and the unknown challenges that lay beyond the next horizon. And if he had learned anything, it was that freedom was fleeting, especially for those who tried to tame it. Days passed, and Kane found himself drawn further into the depths of uncharted waters. Each morning he would wake to find the ocean stretched endlessly before him, as if inviting him to leave his past behind. But on the fourth day, a peculiar sight appeared in the distance. A dark, weathered ship flying no colors, its sails tattered yet full, as though it drifted not by wind but by some otherworldly will. Kane's heart skipped a beat. The ship bore an uncanny resemblance to the Eclipse, though it seemed somehow different, older. As it drew nearer, he felt a strange pull, a whisper in his mind that sent chills down his spine. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he was being watched. The ship's helm stood empty, its deck silent and still. Yet Kane felt a presence, a familiar one. His hand tightened on the Eclipse's wheel, his eyes narrowing as the ghostly ship came alongside, matching his pace without sound or signal. "Morganna," he whispered, his voice swallowed by the wind. But he knew it was her. Somehow, against all reason, she had returned, no longer bound to the Eclipse, but haunting the seas as a free spirit, or something worse. Her laughter, faint but unmistakable, drifted across the waves, filled with the mocking promise that their paths were not yet fully severed. "Until we meet again, Kane," her voice echoed, though no one else could hear it. He watched as the ghostly ship faded into the fog, the shadow of its sails merging with the clouds. Despite the distance between them, he knew that Morganna was watching him, bound to the waves, cursed or blessed by powers they both barely understood. She would haunt the waters, seeking him perhaps forever. For a long time, Kane stood alone at the helm, the shadow of Morganna's ship imprinted on his mind. The sea lay open once more, filled with new challenges, promises, and dangers. The lure of adventure simmered within him, even as a faint warning whispered in his heart. Freedom had a cost, one he would pay time and again, as long as he sailed. With a smirk that only a pirate of the high seas could muster, Kane tightened his grip on the wheel. He would chart a course beyond maps and myths, pushing deeper into the unknown, where cursed treasures and ghostly captains roamed. This time he would navigate not just for survival, but for something greater, a legend of his own making. As the Eclipse drifted westward, its sails catching the early morning breeze, Kane felt the thrill of the chase begin anew. Morganna was out there, somewhere in the mists, but so was he. The ocean was wide, the adventures endless, and no matter how many cursed islands or haunted ships lay ahead, he would meet them all head-on, his fate intertwined with the mystery and danger of the open sea. If you crave more legends of daring escapes, haunted waters, and pirates who challenge both the living and the dead, subscribe to You Pirate. Share this tale with your fellow adventurers, and join us for the next voyage. Who knows what cursed treasures and ghostly foes await beyond the horizon?